This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 78.
Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go.
Well, welcome back. I am so happy to be here with you today. I am so honored for you to spend your very precious time with me today. And I just want to honor you guys for supporting me and honoring yourself and putting your mental health first. I think it's so rad, so cool. I'm just really, really impressed. So thank you for your support. I am so happy to be here with you again this week to talk to you about sharing our story and why we share our story and when we share our story and how we share our story and why you wouldn't share your story. And I'm so thrilled I have a special guest on who I think is actually really good at these types of conversation and has a lot of experience. So I wanted to talk about this today because again, I'm just still overwhelmed with the amazing feedback from the two previous podcasts where I shared my own story about my own journey with mental illness. So many people reached out and said, this inspired me. I feel like I want to share. How do I share? Where do I share? And really seem to want to know about that process. So if me sharing inspired you, I think that's wonderful. I think that's so cool because that's really the point, right? Is the more we share, the less stigma there is. I hope that I really broke down some of the stigma that you may be feeling for yourself. And so I really, really want that to be a part of my mission, particularly for 2019 and forward, is just to keep pushing forward with advocating for people with mental illness. So here we go. But that being said, before we start that, we have a new segment here on Your Anxiety Toolkit, which is all about doing hard things. I know, I keep mentioning it. I keep bringing it up. And so, I'm going to keep bringing it up because I really feel like it's a part of my mission. So what I have done is on the Facebook group, it's our Facebook group, honestly. It's CBT School campus. It's not for Your Anxiety Toolkit, but it's for all of the CBT School products that we have and services and resources we have. So on that group, once a week, I am going to post everyone's hard thing that they're doing. You guys get to write in the comments what you're up to, what you're challenging yourself with, what you're struggling with. And by random, I will pick one each week and show you guys and share with you guys some of the incredible things other people are doing. And my hope with this is to inspire you guys and to hear different people's narratives about how they're doing the hard thing. I think it's super important. So today, the first person I'm going to feature on the I Did a Hard Thing segment is Alyssa. And she says, I went to my neurologist's appointment. Major hard thing. I awaited the test results, then got over my feelings of failure and shame, and I started with a new therapist after accepting that I do need additional support. I also survived hosting Thanksgiving for 17 people with a wired toddler in tow. And so, Alyssa, that is just such a beautiful example of just doing hard things in so many areas. We've got a social, hard thing. We've got a medical hard thing. We've got a mental health hard thing. and parenting hard things. So I really, really applaud you for that hard work. Now, that being said, there are probably 20 different comments on this one post of just story after story of people doing hard things. They share what they did to get themselves through. It was so cool to read. So if you're looking for inspiration or you just need to feel like you're not alone in doing your hard thing, please do come over to the CBT School campus Facebook group, and maybe you'll be on next week's podcast if that's what you want. So I'm so excited. Now, that being said, we're going to move over to the episode. Today, we have Sharla Nicely. And Sharla Nicely is one of my very dear friends. She has been on the podcast before, and she did share a lot about her story because she did write a book about OCD, and she did such a great job at that. But today, even though we've heard a bit of her story, today I really wanted to really quiz her and question her on what her thoughts about sharing stories and our own mental health journey. And her and I together just had a little conversation about the different options you may have and whether it's important to you and how you might do it and where you might do it and what language you might use and how to get through what we called a sharing remorse, or sometimes some people call it vulnerability hangover. I think Brene Brown is the one who called it a vulnerability hangover. So we talk about all the things related to getting to a place to where you're ready to share. So no matter where you are on this journey, you'll probably pick something up from this interview and this conversation because we address it from all the different steps and views. So I'm sure you guys will love it. I'm not going to spend too much time chatting because I know you're here to listen to the amazing Sharla. And so let's just get to it. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. I will speak to you very soon, but please do know that I'm sending out warm, healing vibes to you all because you're my people, and I really, really just value this community so much. Have a wonderful day. So welcome, Sharla.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I am too. Everybody knows I just adore your book. And all my clients, I've literally almost made them buy it. Because I feel like it is a beautiful description of what it's like to have, different struggles specifically for you, OCD. What I want to know, what my hope is for today is for us to really talk about the process of what it's like to share our stories and the pros and the cons and the struggles and the roadblocks that come along. So I think my first question to you is, tell us about when you first started to be ready to share your story, or what were the roadblocks that got in the way?
So I think that I became ready to share my story when I hit a point with my OCD where I had just had it with what it was doing to me. And I was almost I hadn't even gotten exposure therapy at this point yet. So I'm in my late 30s by this point, and I still haven't had exposure therapy. But I had developed a relationship with my OCD where I could sort of stand back from it and laugh at it at times because it was so ridiculous, the things it was doing to me. And I think the point that I became really ready to share was the story that name of the book came from, which is when I used to be obsessing that my cat Fred was in the refrigerator. And, Corey, my partner at the time, he would walk in the kitchen and find me standing there, in front of the refrigerator door, opening and closing the door, looking for Fred. And, I would turn around, I'm like, is Fred in the refrigerator? And we both just laugh because, a lot of times when I was doing this, Fred would walk by or Fred would have just been on Corey's desk. And yet I'm obsessed that somehow he's teleported himself into the fridge. And so I was able to stand back and laugh at this and say, this has been an incredibly tough struggle and OCD has taken a lot from me. But what if I could go out and share how I'm managing dealing with this disorder with other people? And would that be helpful to other people? And would that be helpful to me? And so that's the point when I decided to go ahead and start sharing. And that's when I went to the International OCD Foundation Conference and found out about exposure. And that's, when all my process started in terms of really coming out about what had happened to me and how important it is for people to get exposure therapy.
Right. How much was shame involved in keeping you from sharing? Like, so often, I've had actually several conversations in the last couple of weeks with people who said, I actually feel ready to share, but I'm just so ashamed of the thoughts I'm having or the compulsions that I've done or how this has affected a family member. So what was that like for you?
So for me, I talk about my rule number one, or OCD's rule number one for me. And this is what it told me ever since I was a little kid. And there were two parts to that, and shame was part of it. And one, it would say you can't tell what you see in your head. A lot of my OCD is quite visual, so I would see a lot of, harm type scenes in my head. You cannot tell what you see in your head, because if you do, you'll have to explain yourself. And I think that's the shame piece. Like, how could you possibly explain this?
Right.
And then the other part is, if you do, you'll make the things that you're seeing and thinking about, you'll make them happen. So that was the magical thinking component that was part of that too.
Right.
So I think shame played a big part for me, because the OCD told me that there was no way that I could rationally explain what was going on and have me come out the other side of that conversation not ending up being locked up somewhere.
Right.
And
you mean like by some kind of authority?
Authority, or being declared that there was, I was mentally incompetent, I wasn't safe to be around people, or I was a danger to myself or other people, or why would you have these thoughts,
Right.
And so I think shame was a huge part. Shame and just fear, right? Because if that were to happen, I think Brene Brown talks about shame being that fear of disconnection. That's what my head was telling me, is if I do this, I will be disconnected from people and from society, because I will be shoved off into a corner and sort of put away as a lost cause.
Right. And so I think that is probably the number one explanation that clients of mine or people who have reached out to me via social media have brought up, which is, how on earth can I share and explain myself when I'm having, let's say, sexual obsessions, harm obsessions, any of the obsessions, really, What way can we tell that story in a safe way, in a way that gets the word across in an understandable way?
So I think it's always helpful to practice telling other people who have OCD, because everybody's just going to nod and go, even if somebody didn't, if you were to share you had sexual obsessive thoughts with somebody else who had OCD, they're just going to nod their head, even if they don't have those same thoughts themselves, because we all get it. The content is different, but the process is the same. Right. And so I think starting to share your story in support groups, there are some really good online support groups, finding a local support group, going to an IOCDF local affiliate meeting, going to the conference. That's where I started at the national conference, was I sat down with other people and I started sharing some things there, and they just nodded and said, I know, me too. Right. And so it gave me confidence. It started to make that voice in my head that said that, gosh, you're sort of this person who needs to be locked up and put away. I'm like, well, all these people would need to be locked up and put away too. Right. So maybe that voice in my head is wrong. And so I think it gave me confidence to feel like, okay, wait a minute. These thoughts are just thoughts. They're not actually saying anything negative about me as a person.
Right, right. So you're saying start with the like tribe, like the people similar. Okay, so we're talking about telling stories. We're talking about sharing our personal demon. What about family members who aren't a member of the like tribe, someone who has the same disorder as you? What was that like for you, and what did you practice that as well, or how was that for you?
So I think that's interesting because, my parents eventually found out, although I didn't tell them for years and years and years. Other family members, found out But what's interesting is when my parents read my book, they said, wow, we didn't get this until now. Like, we
Mm,
didn't understand until we heard all these details, really, all that was going on with you. So I think sometimes you can share with family members and you think they might understand, but sometimes it takes them learning a little bit more about OCD to really understand what you mean. You know,
right.
I had another experience of I told a friend in college several years ago that I experienced OCD. And then she read my book and then sent me a note and said, you know, when you told me you had OCD, I didn't really understand what that meant and what you were going through. I read your book and I get it now.
Right.
And so I think sometimes it can be a multi layered approach from people not really understanding exactly what you're saying. And I think part of that is the popular misconceptions of what OCD is. For
Right.
instance, if you're sharing about OCD. And so it can be a multi layered process where you're sort of sharing little bits of information at a time, and gradually people are coming to understand. But I think it's also important to know, and I think you mentioned this in the beautiful story that you told on the podcast, is that people aren't going to totally understand what you're going through unless they have OCD.
Right.
And even then, they're not going to understand exactly what you're going through. And that's okay. I think we're not looking for perfect understanding. We're just looking, like you said, to be heard, which I
Right.
also agree is like a basic human need.
Right, right. So we're talking about this process, and I want to sort of converse back and forward with you on this. Is so I'll share with you my experience. So I had to go through several months of deciding to share my story. Number one, because therapists aren't encouraged to talk too much about themselves. So I had to make a really important ethical decision there. And then once I've decided that then I had to decide how I told the story, right? And so at the end, after all of that, I ended up just sitting in my backyard and just telling the story. It was just off the cuff. But what was really interesting to me is once I released it, I felt a sense of relief, like, oh, it's done, it's out. But what I wasn't expecting was those conversations, just like you talked about with your parents. And I had one too, which was a call from one of my parents to say, I had no idea that was the extent, right? And to be honest, Kimberly, didn't have an idea that they didn't know. Right. And so here I was thinking it was all said and done and I could kind of like wipe my hand, like it's done. But then realizing a part of the story is going through that grief with your family member of like the sadness they feel that they didn't understand. For me, I was actually hurting that I'd maybe hurt my family member. And so was that your experience? For me, that was mine, but was that yours?
I think that, yes, if you think about what the family member is going through, like they had this conception of what was going on. And then you share with them something that is a completely different experience. And so they are having to sort of rethink past history.
Yeah, they got to catch up.
They got to catch up. And I think that's probably pretty challenging for family members to do that. And, family members are going to have their own set of feelings and thoughts about all that. So, yeah. And then you'll have your feelings and thoughts about how you've affected them.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's okay. That's part of the process. That's part of being authentic and appropriately vulnerable with the people that you love. And then having everybody sort of come and be mostly on the same page about, how things were and how things are.
Right. Yeah. I think, again, it was fascinating that I thought I'd done the work I needed to do until I'd like released it. And then I was expecting criticism from some people. I was expecting praise from some people, but I wasn't expecting that one piece of sort of like going through a grief process with friends or family members and so forth. So I thought that was a really fascinating thing to consider when it comes to telling our own story in the form of you writing a book and me telling it in a story of a podcast. Okay, so let's go through some of the steps. So what you talked about, the decision you made was because you kind of just had to, right? You just got to the point.
Why might somebody else tell their story? Like, can you give me your thoughts on why would we tell our story?
So I think that there are a number of reasons to tell your story. I think one reason, and something that I will at times encourage my clients to do, is because it strips away that layer of shame.
Mm.
Because if you are keeping all of this, like with OCD in particular, if you are keeping all this inside and not telling anyone, there's an inherent, I think, belief that this is bad and wrong and I'm bad and wrong. And once you can put it out there and have somebody else sit with you and hear this, and they don't run away from you and they treat you normally, then you start to doubt that voice in your head that says all this is bad and wrong and you're bad and wrong. And that, I think, is an important part of recovery, because these thoughts are just thoughts and they don't mean anything, right? It's that the reaction that the OCD is having to them, that is, the OCD process. And sometimes just seeing that in another person, I think, is helpful for recovery.
Right.
So I think that that's one reason to share. I think another reason to share is because you can help somebody else by doing so. I think a lot of times in our society, we all put this facade on, like everything's awesome. And we're all perfect, everything's great, and it's all what it looks like on Facebook and Instagram and all of that. And I think when friends get together and they actually drop that armor and, say, gosh, this is what's really going on with me. I'm going through this really painful divorce, or I have a son who's going through addiction issues, or I think I'm about to lose my job, or, hey, I have this mental illness. If you're on the receiving end of that, being able to say, you know what, me too. Yeah. Like, I get this because this is what I struggle with. So I understand your struggle. I think when people drop their guard and actually, let a little of their authentic selves come out, sometimes I think it's appropriate to say, hey, you know what? I get that. And I'm not perfect either. I put on this armor as well, but I'm not perfect there. And through that, being able to help the other person feel not alone and feel heard and feel like they're not something weird that we should all sit in the corner and ignore.
Right.
I think, you can also share your story because you found some things that work for you that might work for other people. And so sometimes people will start blogs with their insights and, how they're doing exposures or their therapy and that kind of thing. And I think that can be really helpful too, because it's like you're turning what you've gone through, you're giving meaning to what you've gone through by trying to offer, tips and tricks and other things that you've found helpful that other people might find helpful as well. So those are just a handful of reasons you might want to share.
I saw this fabulous meme the other day that said, I can't afford therapy, so I started a blog. and I actually thought that was brilliant, because I do actually think that is another reason some people do start to share, is that holding it in is like a balloon ready to explode. And sometimes we do just need to let it out in the form of a blog or a book or telling a friend or whatever you want to do. And so I thought that was a really cool point, that, that's another maybe reason that we may need to start that process. Okay, so this is good. Go ahead.
One quick thing, could I add to that? Because it made me remember something. In fact, I think that that's a really great reason to do it, because when I was working on writing Fred, sometimes I'd be writing, like, oh my gosh, wait a minute, I never put that together. Like, it would come out like all these different insights and things about why I'd been doing things or how this had happened, or insights about my OCD, because I was sitting here writing and sort of connecting all the dots. So I totally agree with that. I think it is like, doing your own therapy to write about your experience.
Absolutely. And to be honest, I will share, even as I was sort of, I take lots of walks, and as I would walk, I would think about like, okay, how would I like to tell this story? I want it to be done in a way that is helpful. And even just the discussion I had with Hal and was insight onto how I treat my disorder, right? Like, how do I treat it really precious, or do I treat it like it's something different than me? Do I treat it like it's something currently happening? Do I treat it like it's something that's in the past? And really looking at the language I use around our story, which I think is a super important piece, which I'm actually curious to talk with you about, is how did you pick the language in which to tell your story, right? Like when we're talking about telling our story, are we talking about it past tense or current? You did it in this beautiful sort of fiction slash nonfiction way. What was that like for you to choose the narrative?
I think it was actually, for me, it was a pretty easy process because I used the narrative that I think I've been living. So the way I write the book, that's the relationship that my OCD and I have had. Really, the Is Fed in the Refrigerator is all about the changing relationship between this monster in my head and me. And it sounds a particular way. It sounded a particular way when it was really bad. And I can sort of hear that in my head. To me, it is a different entity than me that's a part of me. And so I just took that and put that on paper because that's what was real for me, is this discussion with my OCD and how it changed and how my relationship and my view of my OCD changed as the power structure differential between us changed.
Right. Okay, so you did it in book form, and so many people I have heard say they want to write a book or they want to at least share their story in an article, right? What steps did you have to go through to actually get those words down on paper? What were the biggest roadblocks for you?
So it took me almost 10 years to get all those words down on paper. And I think the biggest roadblock was probably fear and perfectionism. Because having OCD, what I would hear when I would sit down is sort of my OCD's, sneering voice saying, you don't have anything to say. You better not even start because it's not even going to be perfect. And, how are you going to, and this is a huge story. I mean, where are you even going to start? Like this part you're thinking of now, this is ridiculous. You can't start that. So, like narrative going on in my head. And I would listen to that a lot. And I'm like, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. And it would be interesting to, hear from writers who don't have OCD, whether that's part of their process too, whether they have this little voice in their head that tells them that why bother starting if they can't be perfect. And so I think I probably lost a lot of writing time to saying, oh yeah, later, oh yeah, later, oh yeah, later. And finally, I decided to start working on it. And once I got going and decided just to write and that I would just get it down, then I actually made process. But I probably spent 7 years going tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll just do it tomorrow.
Right. And I think that's a really good point, is just to write it down and get it down. And this is for someone who maybe doesn't want to write a book, and you talked about like practicing sharing with people. I think it's helpful just to free write it down without judgment and without even the intention that you're going to share it anytime soon. I think that's actually the part of the work, right? We're coping ahead. We're planning for the sharing, if that's what you want to do, is share. I think it is that just practicing that non-judgment piece that you were talking about. It's funny for me, I have a good friend and we often meet on the weekends and we might just write a blog post together, and we actually use the Pomodoro technique, which is where you do 25 minutes on and then a bell rings and then you get a 10-minute break and then you do 20 minutes on. And I find that to be really helpful because otherwise it just feels so overwhelming. But it's funny how in the breaks, our whole psychology can change. So we'll sit down and we'll do the first one and we'll be like, that was so good. I feel so good about what I wrote. And then the next one, they'll be like, yeah, maybe this is just something I won't use. And I'll be like, what happened? Like you were so excited. And I think that's how our brain gets involved, right? Like it gets too up in our head. Of course, our brain is in our head, but our thoughts get up in our head. Tell me about the self-criticism. Like, how did you release? Okay, so you wrote the book. How did you release this into the world?
With a lot of trepidation. I mean, when I was writing, Fred, sometimes I would say, well, I'm just going to get this down and I may shove it in a drawer and not do anything with it. That was sort of my way to, give myself an out.
Right.
And maybe to shut up the criticism I was hearing in my head too. Like, I'm just going to get this down. I'll deal with it later, sort of thing.
Not a bad tool though. Not a bad coping tool.
Yeah. And I think it also released me from pressure, because if I'm writing to definitely release this, there was sort of more of a sense of perfectionism, but I'm writing it just to get it down and I may shove it in a drawer and no one may ever see it. Okay. That makes it a little easier to write. But, as I released it to different layers of people, so, I had some people who helped me along the way and got feedback from them. But then, I'd release it to a little bit larger crowd, to get early reviews and that kind of thing. It was always hard going to that next level or that next layer of people, because even if I'd gotten, helpful or good feedback on one layer and sort of made changes or whatever, and then I sent it to the next layer, there was always that, oh no, what if they say this is horrible and
Right.
this is unpublishable and you can't do this? And so, and the other thing was, what if, so it went back to the very beginning. What if they think that, like, you're not qualified to be a therapist, your OCD is way worse than they ever thought, like
Right.
you really should, sort of be in a corner all by yourself.
Right.
Like,
Right.
what if people don't respect you anymore because they know that your OCD still bothers you every now and then? And so there were those kind of questions that would come up in my head that would sort of take me a little bit back to the beginning when I was starting to think about telling my story. But it was always a lot easier. I wasn't going back to the beginning.
Right.
But I looked at it as an exposure, like, okay, yep, sending this out here. And I'm going to try to act like all that I'm hearing in my head doesn't matter to me. And I'm going to go on because I don't have control over what people think.
Right. It's true. And I think a big piece, I'll just sort of add my experience, is what came up for me was once I told this story and the response was amazing. But I think my biggest fear was being seen as now weak, right? Like, it's so fascinating as a mental health professional who's someone who advocates for mental health all the time, that even me started to think, well, now I must be weak because they know. And I was like, wait, what? How did this still come up in me after I've preached to clients like mental illness doesn't make you weak? But that weakness word came up of like, okay, now they're going to see you as weak. And I thought that was so fascinating how weakness was a big thing that came up for me. I felt good about, I actually want to stop for a second and really applaud you and tell you how much I admire you, because knowing that you and some other colleagues I have who have shared made me feel like I could ride on your back. Like, well, they've done it, so I'm safe. So I think that's actually the message here, is that when you do it, it makes other people safe to feel like they can do it too. But I was not expecting the weakness thing to come up.
Yeah. And I think I may be misquoting Brene Brown, but I think she calls that a vulnerability hangover.
That's exactly what she calls it.
Oh, and I think that that's a really good term for it, because it's this feeling of, oh my gosh, I said what? I put what out into the world? Can I take that back?
Right.
So yeah, I get that completely.
Right.
And I think, and I am so glad that you shared your story, because so interesting what we talked about earlier about people not knowing. Like, there was a lot of your story that I didn't know as I was listening to it on the podcast. And I think, our experience, like your experience thinking, what are people thinking? My guess is what people are thinking on the other end is, wow, I'm
Right.
so impressed that she's sharing this and that she went through this and she, came out the other side, not perfect and totally fixed, like you said, but that she's willing to put it out there and share. And again, like you said, maybe I could do that too.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it brings me back to like you and me when we first met, having a glass of wine at one of the conferences. We immediately went in and told each other all of our stuff. That's right? Like
I think so,
probably
yeah.
talked for 10 minutes before I was like, so what disorder do you have? And it opened up for like, okay, so Charlotte's safe. She's a safe person. And from there, I feel like you've been one of my closest friends regarding these things and talking through struggles. And so I think that there is this mutual agreement once we share of like, oh, she's a safe person.
Right.
Right.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think it's such a huge piece of that work, right? And it's funny because we talk about a vulnerability hangover, and I love Brene Brown's, wording there, but I always think of when we bought our first house and you have buyer's remorse.
Mm-hmm.
And the real estate agent, our lovely real estate agent, warned us, like, you're going to have buyer's remorse the next day. You're going to want to take back everything that you did. And that's, I think, what we do too, is it's not just a vulnerability hangover, but a part of us is like, take it back, put it back in, like, stuff it back in my mouth. You know what I mean? And I think that's a part of this process, is knowing you might have a vulnerability hangover, is knowing you might have story remorse, I think we might call it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Yeah, story remorse.
It's story remorse. And you question. What was interesting to me is when I recorded it, I was like, okay, that was imperfect. That's the way I wanted it to be. And then a part of me was like, we have to listen to it back. Like, we have to know what you just said. And I think that's a piece of knowing that that's a part of the process, but to be ready for it,
Mm-hmm.
prepared
Yes,
for
absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
it. What would you say the tools are you need to have when you do have story remorse or vulnerability hangover?
I think having someone that you can share your experience with, somebody who will be empathic and understanding, just to say, yeah, I get why you might feel like that. And I'm really glad you did what you did. And I get why you feel like that. It's not like to necessarily provide reassurance, something that those of us with OCD are trying always not to get, right, to stay in the good recovery,
Right.
but to know you're not alone.
Right.
To be able, going back to Brene Brown's work, she talks about, dealing with shame. It's helpful to have a trusted other that you can go to and sort of share when you're feeling shamed, because shame can't survive when it's put in the light.
Right.
And, putting it in the light with somebody you can trust just to be with another person.
Right.
But I think the other thing too to do is, again, this is really an exposure to put your story out there, whatever you're struggling with. And to really work on acceptance of that you just cannot control what people think. I'm always just sort of flabbergasted when I go on YouTube and, like I was looking for how to sew a hole in a sock last night, believe it or not. This is my very favorite pair of University of Illinois socks, had like multiple holes in them. And I don't live anywhere near University of Illinois, so I can't like go get another pair easily. So I'm like, I'm going to fix these socks. So I'm on this video of how to fix a sock. And, they always have the thumbs down and the thumbs up thing. And there are like 43 thumbs down. I'm like, how can you not like this video of just how to sew a sock? Right? It doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think in our culture today, people are thumbs upping and thumbs downing all sorts of stuff, and just recognizing you don't have any control over that. Who knows why people are thumbs downing you if they are? It's probably more about them and their reaction than it is about you. And just recognizing that when you put something out there, you are setting it free and you don't have control over sort of what it's going to do and what people are going to say. And that's okay.
Right.
That's okay.
Right. And you and I have had this conversation, which is, to add on to that, is putting yourself out there is accepting that there will be haters, right? Like the further you reach, the higher you aim, the more you brave, the more the people who aren't in the ring, to use Brene Brown again, are going to criticize. The people who criticize you aren't the people in the ring with you. They're the people who are too afraid to do what you're doing or too judgmental to do what you're doing. So I think it's really knowing that, I mean, I think for me, even just this podcast, I'm like, if there's not a hater somewhere, I'm obviously not pushing my limit high enough, right? I'm not being bold enough, because the criticism is sort of like your gauge that you're on the right track almost, I feel like. So shifting that expectation.
Yeah, and you've always been really good about sharing that with me and reminding me of that, right? That if you're getting criticism, that probably means that you're really stretching out there, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So you've taught me a lot about that, and I think that that's also a really good way to look at it. Like, oh, look, a 1-star review. Oh, look, 3 thumbs down.
Right. It means that you're putting yourself out there and you're being brave. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Should everyone share? What is your opinion?
I think this is a really personal decision. I don't think there are any have tos about this. I think if it feels like it would be helpful to you to share, then you can share. But there are degrees of sharing, right? It's not like if you share, gosh, the whole world has to know. You can start with one or two people. Some people will do blogs, but not even put their real name on it. Like they're sharing, but they're not quite ready to, put who they are sort of with all the words yet. And that's okay. So I think that if you want to share, that's fabulous. And if you don't want to share, I think that's okay too. Like you don't have to feel like you need to share. The only time that I really, with clients, will highly encourage somebody to share is if I have clients who are not telling their significant others about the content of their OCD thoughts because of shame.
Right.
And that's a time that I might say, I really think this is a therapeutically appropriate thing to do. Why don't you bring your spouse in or your significant other in and let's talk about it together? Because I think at that point, it's becoming not sharing with that person is becoming a tool being wielded by the OCD.
Right.
But outside of that therapeutic intervention that somebody might do with a therapist, I don't think that and even that's not a have to, right? That's just an encourage. I don't think there are any have tos around this, and you shouldn't feel like, oh, I have to share, or I'm not in a good recovery, or there's something wrong with me that I'm not coming out and telling this story. That's okay too.
Right. And I have to be cognizant of that too, because I'm always talking about, it's a beautiful day to do hard things and you can be brave, but I don't want people to feel like you're not brave if you're not ready, or that you're weak because you can't go out and shout it out onto a podcast or write a book about it. Like that's definitely not the point here. It's, again, I'll share. I didn't share until 10 years later. You, I think, are similar, right? Like you had it for a very long time. And I think it's okay to give yourself time. It was Cheryl Strayed who said, don't share, and this is her advice, it's not mine, but she said, don't share something in the heat of your meltdown, right? Like give it time, give yourself time to do some healing around that. And I thought that was an interesting concept because I think sometimes when we're so fed up, we're like, okay, fine, I'm just going to go onto Facebook and I'm going to hash it out. And it's like, you don't have to do that either. I think it's, be careful with, who you share with and don't go from 0 to 100.
Yeah, agree completely.
Right. Okay. So let's sort of round it out. What would you say if I had to say, what is your basic advice to someone who's ready to share? What would you say to them?
I would say that, make a list of people that you think might be good candidates for hearing this, and then pick one of them, probably the person you think is the most empathic, the most caring, the most understanding, and start with them. Again, if you don't have anybody like that in your life, finding an OCD support group. The International OCD Foundation has a list of support groups. There are ones that are in person and there are online ones. And share there because you'll have, I think, a good reception sharing with other people if you're sharing about OCD, for instance, or if it's another disorder, find another type of support group that you can share with like-minded people. But I think start small, be ready for story remorse, and know that's okay.
Yeah.
And maybe take it slowly. Rome wasn't built in a day. You don't have to sort of share everything at once. Take it piece by piece and think about it as sort of, this is, it's a beautiful day to do hard things. This is going to be a hard thing, right?
Right.
And you can sort of space it out. You don't have to do it all at once.
Right. Right. I love that. And what I would add, because that's exactly what I would say, is I love your idea of rehearsing, but not just rehearsing what you say even, but just being prepared for the event. A lot of self-care around the day that you decide to share and the next day, the hangover day, right? And being really gentle. Make sure you're in a space where it's not too chaotic so that you can sort of be there for yourself as you have to ride all of those waves of discomfort, the many, many waves that you probably will feel. And so I think that that's beautiful advice in terms of picking a certain person and going there first. And so now, one more question. Now that you've told your story, how do you feel?
fine. But I think that, had you asked me that at different points along the journey, I would have had very different
Right.
responses to that question.
So
Sometimes it
right
would have
here
been,
at 12 o'clock, you're feeling fine.
yeah, right now I'm feeling fine. But, you could have asked me, before I gave the keynote, the word would have been paralyzed. After the keynote, it probably would have been numb. The day that Fred released, probably anxious, So, and even, if I have to go to the Amazon website page where Fred is today, I can be anxious going to that because I don't know what I'm going to see in
Right.
terms of reviews and stuff. So I think it varies by situation and day.
Right.
Now I'm fine.
That's the perfect answer. I think what I was expecting you to say is like, I feel really great about it. But that is such a real answer, which is like, I feel all the feels. Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think for me, I feel really happy that I shared. I still notice the feelings that come up around certain things. And I use them, I just note them. Like I kind of put them in a little folder in my brain and go, okay, I've got some work to do around feeling weak, or I've got some work to do around that self-judgment. And I just take note of them for like, okay, notes for later. Let's be really gentle with me about this one topic that seems to be bothering me. So I think that's such a real good answer. A good, real answer, I should say. Yeah.
And I think one other resource I'd like to give people who might be wanting to share is Project Hope Exchange.
Mm-hmm.
So Project Hope Exchange is a joint initiative from the Adversity to Advocacy Alliance, which is an organization that Jeff Bell started, and he's my advocacy partner in Beyond the Doubt, and Life Fest Inside. So the HA Alliance and Life Fest Inside came together to start Project Hope Exchange. And you can go there and you can leave 30-second messages of hope for other people. And it can be sort of any issue that you're going through, mental health, life situations. And they will take those and then put them on the website so other people can listen to them. So, you can go there now if you're feeling in need of some hope and support. You can go there and listen to these 30-second messages of hope that other people have left. But you can also leave one. And you don't have to leave your whole name, right? You could just say, hey, I'm Lisa, and here's my story. And, so it might be a good way to stick your toe in terms of sharing your story in a way that would not only help you, but probably help some other people too.
Right. And it can be anonymous?
Yeah, it can be anonymous because you can just use your first name and
there you go. So you could even do it as a small step towards, sharing. I love that. And what
Absolutely.
I would also have, and this will be at the beginning of the podcast, is every podcast episode now, we are going to have a new segment called I Did a Hard Thing, where people can go on to CBT School Campus, the Facebook group, and post the hard thing they did. And I'll select one per week and I'll read it out. So that's another option for people if they're already on CBT School Campus, is the I Did a Hard Thing segment will actually start today in this episode. So I'm excited about that being a way for people to dip their toe in as well. But, you could do both. I think it's important to be brave in all the areas if you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Charlotte. I feel like this is so helpful for those people who are dabbling in this conversation and this topic.
Well, thank you so much for having me on today. I was honored to be here and to talk about what I do think is a really important topic.
Thank you. I'm so pleased. Have a great day.
You too.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.